Thanks for coming to this event. I've introduced most of the speakers for these series of talks, and I've usually always said it's a pleasure or it's an honour to introduce the given speaker. Usually I've been lying. So today it really is a great pleasure. I really am happy to have John here. I've heard him speak a couple of times before. He's brilliant. I'm sure he'll be brilliant again. He is Professor of Sociology at the University of Nottingham. He is the co-founder of the Campaign for the Public University. He is, or used to be, the president of the British Sociology Association. Is that correct? Yeah. And today he's going to talk about the university, democracy, and the public interest. So, welcome, John.
Well, thanks very much. It's a pleasure to be here, and particularly amongst such a distinguished set of speakers, perhaps particularly David Willits, who gave the first lecture in the series. And of course, people know that he, as former Minister for Universities and Science, was responsible for introducing the most far-reaching reforms in higher education since the Robbins Report. And in the lecture he gave, which I watched on YouTube, as in all his other publications during his tenure as minister and since, he has continually invoked the principles of the Robbins Report and represented the recent reforms, including up to the recent Green Paper developed by his successor, Joe Johnson. He said that these are fully consistent with the Robbins Report, and even more, that in fact these reforms bring the Robbins ambitions to their final fruition and completion. So I'm going to take issue with that claim, and to do so by addressing a topic that I think has been almost entirely absent from discussions of the recent reforms, and that's the contribution of the university to democratic life. So the government, and David Willits in his lecture, makes reference to the positive attributes of graduates as citizens. So insofar, I mean, they don't make a lot of it, but they do make the reference that graduates are more tolerant, participate more in politics, volunteer more, have better health, etc. And that's one of the one set of public benefits of the university. But they do not discuss how higher education contributes more fundamentally to democracy. And indeed, as Stefan Collini has pointed out, the figure of the student that appears in all reports, white and green papers since Brown, and including Brown, is that of the consumer of education and investor in human capital. And equally, the only contribution of the university that receives any substantial discussion is its contribution to economic growth in a neoliberal and globalized knowledge economy. So let me sort of begin by describing briefly the functions of the university as set out by David Willits. This is the topic of his first lecture. Training for professional and highly skilled employment, personal development, the development of character. I mean, the thing about David Willits is he's very fond of providing the historic resonance of what the university is about, notwithstanding the undermining of all those aspects of its tradition. So personal development, the development of research, particularly associated with German universities and taken up strongly by in the United States. And then he added a fourth one in that lecture, which was applied practical knowledge in the service of local interests, which he referred to as being brought into being by the development of civic universities at the end of the 19th century, challenging the dominance of Oxford and Cambridge within the system. Now, the four functions were also set out by Robbins, and they're similar in Robbins. At least the first two are the same, and then they go on somewhat differently. So, public benefit of skilled and educated workforce, the public benefit of securing the advancement of learning through the combination of teaching and research. And it's very important in Robbins that the combination of teaching and research, because of course that's something that Willits contemplates separating, and the recent Green Paper is also all about, or a large part of it is about the separation of teaching and research. And the public benefit of providing common culture and standards of citizenship. So, in addition to thinking about four functions and them being somewhat parallel but not quite the same as those in Robbins, the former minister's references to the likely disruptive role of new technologies in unbundling the functions of the universities necessarily means that Robbins' idea of a multifunctional university is directly under threat. And David Willits suggests that that threat is sort of an external threat coming from technology, whereas, of course, it's a threat coming from the embrace of a public policy that allows that unbundling to be a possible outcome. And it's also one that's advocated most strongly by for-profit providers of higher education and Pearson in particular. So one could say, well, if one is trying to be generous to what David Willits means, perhaps the issue is less that all universities must embody the same functions, as that they should be well represented in a healthy system of higher education. This, after all, was the view of Robbins, and Robbins in particular made a great emphasis about bringing into being the idea of higher education as a system, as opposed to what he regarded as a rather disordered amalgamation of institutions and approaches. But there is no concept of a system of higher education in the current government's approach. Public benefit is equated with the effective operation of a market for higher education, notwithstanding that only functions that will be met are those that can be met within the market. So it's one thing to talk about multiple functions, another thing to ensure that those functions can be reproduced, particularly if they're associated with public benefits, when the market is all about private interests and private benefits within higher education. But most striking, I think, is that the public benefit of providing a common culture and standards of citizenship is missing entirely in Willits' account, and also in the wider debate. And just show you one of the things that, I mean, it's amusing to a certain sort of jaded sense of humour, but people are probably aware that what Robbins does is set out an axiom that applies in thinking about the nature of higher education. So he has one axiom and four principles or four public benefits. And the government has never committed itself straightforwardly to the axiom. The axiom is the access to higher education for everybody who has an interest in pursuing it and can benefit from it. But Willits has got a parallel axiom, and that's from the availability of higher education to the availability of loans. And so it's almost directly parallel to the claim that and this is what Willits means by bringing Robbins to fruition within a neoliberal higher education system, that there should be access to loans to everybody who could benefit from higher education. But before I elaborate on what is going on in the changes to the university, because for me it's quite important to establish that the higher education under the Robbins ideals, which roughly covered, bearing in mind that Robbins is commenting on something coming into being as well as bringing something into being. So if one says the developments of higher education from the early 60s through until the 1980s, I think something very distinctive happens after the 1980s, and it's to do with the relationship of higher education to its context and how a particular kind of context is allowed to reshape the university. So I'd say that when Robbins wrote, there was a strong commitment and a strong belief in the inclusive benefits of economic growth. That meant that what economic growth would do would improve, and the term that was used is the adaptive upgrading of all jobs. And that inclusive benefit of economic growth is also reflected in a secular decline in income inequalities. So more or less you can see how this is from data by the Piketty project, shows declining inequality in the UK and in the US from the 1940s through to the 1980s. And that is the high point of the development of the idea of public higher education and the commitments expressed in the Robbins report. So although it's correct to say, as Willitson frequently does, that Robbins is after all a liberal economist, so he's no left progressive, the nature of his commitment to economics is as a liberal. He was a member of the Mont Pelerin Society and subsequently expressed an interest in income contingent loans, which is what Willits regards as the bringing to completion of Robbins. However, income contingent loans were rejected by the Robbins report, and for several reasons. The prediction of future incomes was regarded as too difficult, but also that the expansion of higher education was expected to reduce the returns to higher education. And of course the report was written in a context where even liberal economists believed in the reality of the Kuznets curve. And that's the Kuznets curve going on down there, which is economic growth is associated with a decline in inequalities. And of course Piketty's recent work on capital in the 20th century is devoted to demolishing the idea of the Kuznets curve to reflect the upturn in inequalities since the 1980s. But that sense of declining inequalities, and in a sense the commitment to higher education in the context of reduced inequalities and an inclusive economic growth, is part of what I want to say is the meaning of the public university and its contribution to democracy. So this is a sort of kind of lengthy introduction to set out the scope of the talk. So how do we understand the public interest in the university in a context where higher education is now explicitly enjoined to economic ends of facilitating economic growth, but the latter is no longer understood to be inclusive in its consequences? Nobody writing on higher education now associates it with a commitment to reducing inequality. And yet that's the context of the Robbins report. What is the university's relation to democracy in the context of its increasing subordination to market mechanisms? And what are the consequences of these mechanisms for the corporate form of the university? So I want to suggest that the character of the university changes. It's not simply that the external environment of the university changes as we move into a period of rapidly widening inequality, but also the internal organisation of the university changes in that time, and changes in ways that are relevant for how we should think about democracy. And I want to say that one of the consequences for the corporate form of the university is associated with what I call the deprofessionalisation of the academic role. that is the subordination of academics within managerial hierarchies. And we need to ask, well, how does deprofessionalisation affect the academic role? Which is also to ask the question, is what are the functions of professions for democracy? And it's kind of, from a sociological perspective, it's kind of unfashionable to talk about the functions of the professions for democracy, because there was previously a critique of professions as being about hierarchy and monopolistic appropriation of knowledge and so on. Well, if you think that was bad, consider what managerial hierarchy and the marketisation of knowledge do for democracy and for inequality. And of course there's another puzzle. Why have these questions been absent from recent debates on the university? So why have we forgotten what was standard ways of thinking about the universities in the 1960s, 70s and through in the 80s? So I want to address these questions, including the last meta question, by a very specific understanding of the university as an institution of what Habermas calls the public sphere. That is, the space between the state and the market in which public discourse of pressing social and political issues is facilitated. People familiar with Habermas's analysis will recognise that for him a properly functioning public sphere is necessary for a healthy democracy. And one could think then of the university as part of the institutional fabric of the public sphere. And I'm going to refer to a somewhat unfashionable US sociologist, Talcott Parsons, who wrote at the same time as Habermas and referred to the institutions of the public sphere as part of a modern democratic citizenship complex. And so you see, if I see the university then in all its different aspects as corporate form, in its relation to issues of inequality and so on, in terms of its organisation through professional expertise rather than managerial hierarchy, I want to connect all those things to the idea of citizenship and to suggest then that the dismantling and the unbundling of the university is a dismantling and unbundling of the citizenship complex. So, just briefly, and you know, it's partly to do with, well, why haven't we sort of noticed this, is because that suggests in some ways when we were engaged with debates in the downswing of the curve, the reductions of inequality hadn't gone far enough. So we were pushing beyond the low point represented in the late 1970s to think of further extensions of democracy, more inclusive economic growth, greater reductions of inequality, and thinking about some of the obstacles. And some of those obstacles were attributed to the welfare state itself, that the welfare state, rather than being integral to the citizenship complex and integral to a process of reducing inequality, was itself becoming an obstacle to the further reductions of inequalities. It'd be evident that I think that was a mistaken judgment, but nonetheless it meant that the general tenor of argument in the through the 70s and 80s was that the problems of late capitalism, this is certainly Habermas's account, required the stabilising interventions of a welfare state, and the university was understood as part of a new administrative complex politically constrained towards instrumental purposes. So there was a criticism of the instrumentalisation of the university taking place in the 70s and 80s, and that's a context, if we think back, when we're talking about the increased dominance of utilitarian interest within the university, as Stefan Collini has done in his recent article in the LRB, that's a utilitarianism derived from the market, which is set against a utilitarianism deriving from political influence. And I think the consequence of these arguments is that the democratic significance of the university is weakly understood and defended, especially in a context where the welfare state itself has been put into question. To some degrees, what is happening to the university and higher education, it has already happened to other areas of public services and provision, and the university is merely the last step towards that process of dismantling public services and reducing all public benefit to private interests. And so in effect, the expansion of higher education since the Second World War comes to be assigned to two phases. First, associated with the rise of administered capitalism and the Fordist welfare state. The second, with a post-Fordist phase, which has a particular alignment with a reorganized knowledge economy, invigorated by new disruptive technologies now to be applied to higher education. In each phase, the university is represented as potentially deformed by the dominance of instrumental rationalities, deriving from state direction in one case and from the market in the other. But there's a failure here to set out the positive substance of the university for democracy, that is, the ideal against which it can be said to be malformed. And that plays into neoliberal discourse. So people who listen to David Willetts's lecture in this series will recognise that as well as addressing the functions of higher education, he also addressed the university as a corporation. And in talking about the university as a corporate form, he stressed its autonomy as a self-governing entity. In this way, he highlighted its autonomy from the state by suggesting that the autonomy that is crucial to the university could be the same as that of any private for-profit corporation operating within a competitive market. And of course, many vice-chancellors see their institutions now in that way, and their role as a chief executive. And of course, current government policies, those that were initiated by Willets, are directly designed to facilitate the entry of a single teaching function for-profit higher education providers with the title of university. And the Green Paper also entertains the possibility of changing the legal status of current universities, including the possibility either of them failing, exiting is the phrase that is used, or becoming for-profit organisations themselves. But I think quite a lot is at stake here, and it's to do with how we understand the corporate form of the university as a collegial organisation, which I think is central to the Robbins report and isn't really discussed in current arguments about reforms. And to some degree, commentators on the university, even those who are hostile to the reforms, have sold the pass by arguing that the expansion of universities in the post-war period, and especially the research university, has meant that they've increasingly resembled large corporations. And what is unexamined is the changing nature of the corporation itself across the relevant period. So a convergence among corporations, university as a corporation and other large-scale organisations, can occur by the university becoming more like a private for-profit corporation, or by a private for-profit corporation becoming more like a university. When the Robbins report was written, the latter is broadly what a number of people writing about the economy and writing about universities believed was happening, and followed in the context of the emergence of the knowledge society, so-called. It's significant that then the term was knowledge society, and now the term is knowledge economy. So what's at issue in the shift from society to economy in the ways this is being mobilized? And as an American social historian, Howard Brick, has written that the time when the Robbins report was written, although he's not specifically referring to Robbins but to developments in the US, was when a number of sociologists believed in the transcendence of capitalism in the narrow sense of capitalist political economy defining social relations, reinterpreting the developments otherwise identified by Habermas at more or less the time in a fundamentally more positive register. So now what I'm going to do is give an account of what it means to talk about the emergence of a citizenship complex and how it was understood to bring all corporations under its ambit, and how the university was, if you like, the lead institution in that development. So rather than the reduction of modern society to capitalist economy, what we might roughly say as the neoliberal project, what was occurring, it was argued, was the embedding of capitalist economy within modern values of achievement and egalitarianism. That's the significance of the reduction in inequality that is being perceived. Providing thereby not simply a normative grounding of the public sphere, but also of the market economy itself within the norms held to be dominant within the public sphere, achievement and egalitarianism. In making this argument, Parsons broadly accepted T.H. Marshall's account of the process in terms of the development and extension of civil and political rights to include social rights. Civil rights provided the framework of relations between the societal community and the state in terms of issues of free expression and assembly. Political rights determined participation in the selection of government through the extension of the franchise. But the final key was social rights, which addressed the welfare of citizens, in quotation marks now, treated as a public responsibility to secure the provision of realistic opportunities to make good use of other rights. So political and civil rights were empty unless there were measures to address obstacles to the realization of those rights, and those measures were in the form of social rights. So social rights would seek, and this again is a quote, to ensure that adequate minimum standards of living, health, care and education are available, end of quote. And Parsons went on to argue that, quote, it's particularly notable that the spread of education to ever wider circles of the population, as well as an upgrading of the levels of education, has been closely connected to the development of the citizenship complex. So the citizenship complex is civil rights, political rights, social rights, and how those are embedded institutionally. Now, a neglected aspect of Marshall's account, so assuming some of you might be familiar with T.H. Marshall's discussion of social rights, was also the treatment of trades union rights and the secondary system of industrial citizenship. So citizenship was being thought of as organising the labour market, organising the economy, and not simply political and social sectors. So it's not simply that there was a pressure for redistribution of resources outside employment, but was also pressure to transform employment itself through trade unions, rights of representation and association. And in part, this involved the transformation of an earlier status distinction between salaried employment and waged employment. And of course, the issue of status differences is incredibly important to how we think of, and status differences and their reproduction, to how we think of the university historically. And so why we should think of the public university as a distinctive moment in the development of the university at a period where status differences are being challenged, and challenged not simply in terms of the meaning of higher education, but also across other sectors as well. So the labour contract and its regulation became, for Marshall and for others writing in this vein, part of employment citizenship with similar rights and protections across different occupations. And this is what it meant to talk about the adaptive upgrading of all jobs. And it was itself important to the legitimacy of higher education for those who don't go to university, as was recognised in the Robbins report. So when Robbins says, why should people who don't go to university pay for university, it's precisely because a university is part of these changes, which are inclusive, and they're inclusive because they're about the undermining of established differences. So also for Parsons, the citizenship complex is understood as transforming the corporation not simply from below, that is by generalising the labour contract and reducing status differences, but also from above. And what Parsons was trace civil, political and social development of organisational forms occurring first through an orientation to the market, then increased scale introduces distinct occupational roles, requirements of bureaucratic management, but the final development is associational forms of organisation which extend throughout the societal community but are also increasingly important, he believed, in what he regarded as the fiduciary boards of large corporations, which took on roles of social responsibility. Now, what is significant about the account is that he explicitly understands the core structure of the university to be associational, that is, collegial. So collegial and associational are synonyms, and uses its mode of organisation to account for wider developments. In other words, if the modern university becomes more like a corporation in this period, this is because at the same time the corporation becomes more like a university. Now this might seem a bizarre claim to be made, but I'll develop it because what I want to show is how significant it is from the point of view of the idea of the profession and of the academy itself as a professional role. So Parsons partly attributes it to the large corporate separation of ownership from the functions of management. This assigns managers a political role in the corporation, that's political in an inverted comma, reconciling different claims upon it. In that way, management for Parsons becomes a profession similar to other professions. So it's one of the reasons why business schools develop and business education becomes important. And it's similar to other professions in terms of the obligations that lie with professions. With the development of social rights and services provided directly through public authorities, what is involved, in Marshall's words, are the professions are being socialised and social and public services are being professionalised. The socialisation of the professions is partly what makes sense of current National Health Service dispute and how doctors are, and the British Medical Association are connected to that. Professions are brought to connect the welfare of the individual client with obligations to the wider public, and at the same time the professionalisation of services means that they're provided in a manner befitting social rights of citizenship. That is, as a service to individuals regarded as equal members of the political community rather than as recipients of charity. So again, the character of how individuals are related to services and through that to professions and the relation of professions to their clients becomes different as a consequence of these developments. And to some extent then, the development of the professions follows the track of the university itself. Indeed, this is so because a university is responsible for what Parsons calls the cognitive complex and its normative significance within modern society. Cognitive complex means simply that the university becomes one of the major institutional areas in which knowledge is produced and reproduced on behalf of society. And while the professions are the outward face of the knowledge society and its demand for specialised expertise, the university is increasingly the guarantor of the knowledge basis of that expertise and its development through research. So when Willits talks about the development of the applied function, applied knowledge is one of the functions of the university. The context in which applied knowledge develops is sociologically very different from what he was setting out. So the autonomy of the university then, I think, takes on a new meaning once we understand the development of the citizenship complex, and it's a meaning different from viewing autonomy from the perspective of the market. Knowledge within the citizenship complex is at service to the societal community in which, as Parsons puts it, the principles of equality have broken through to a new level of pervasiveness and generality. A societal community as basically composed of equals seems to be the end of the line in a long process of undermining the legitimacy of older, more particularistic, ascriptive bases of membership. So I kind of want to link the university strongly to that, to say the university cannot be separated from discussions of and our understandings of equality, inequality, and its reproduction. And for us to now be living under a period of accelerating inequality is affecting our democratic life. So we can now begin to understand the widening inequality of incomes and wealth outlined by Piketty, among others, as part of a process of a dismantling of the citizenship complex and the re-emergence of ascriptive bases of membership. This goes hand in hand with continued rhetoric about equal opportunities, but inheritance of social positions has become more evident, not least in low and stable or declining rates of social mobility, against the expectation that modern societies were becoming more open. In particular, social rights of citizenship are under challenge, but this is not simply an issue of distributive justice and the withdrawal of a public commitment to adequate minimum standards of living, healthcare and education, as it was put in the 70s and 80s. Another corollary is the deprofessionalisation of public and social services as their recipients are transformed from clients to undeserving recipients and or customers of services who would be better served by private providers. So these connections are all straight through. But it's not simply a matter of widening inequality, but the character of services and the nature of organisational forms as the citizenship complex is reduced to market and bureaucracy, and then from bureaucracy to the market. And it's in this context that we should now understand more recent changes to the corporate form of the university, as following changes to the wider corporation, as the associational nature of corporations and the university alike are dismantled. The university is becoming increasingly like that of a business corporation, where its organisational principles involve diminishing its associational aspects, including the deprofessionalisation of its academic staff. We could not expect this to happen to business organisations and not happen within universities as well. So the dismantling of the citizenship complex is also directed at the nature of the corporation, where the professional manager had been identified as responsible to multiple stakeholders. Under a neoliberal conception, there's only one stakeholder, those with private property rights in the organisation, and one objective, to maximise profit. Here the issue is how to maximise shareholder value and marketise the internal transactions of the corporation. One way which this is done is by redefining what is core business and by disposing of activities via outsourcing, as well as by redefining the labour contract. Indeed, the latter is also frequently achieved by outsourcing, where social rights associated with employment citizenship were part of the upgrading of labour and overcoming a division between secondary and primary labour markets by extending, and what is happening now is what was previously a characteristic of the secondary labour market is being made the characteristic of all jobs, apart from a few remaining privileged sites of employment. So the redefinition of the labour contract upholds employers' rights over those of employees, and is part of a polarisation of jobs, which has paradoxically gone hand in hand with the maintenance of demand for higher education. So at the same time as the growth in privileged jobs has not kept up with the number of graduates, the anxieties created by changing labour market conditions maintains pressures to secure formal qualifications, which it will, if they will not guarantee advantaged employment, at least provide the best opportunity of avoiding disadvantaged employment. So what I'm suggesting to you is the reforms to higher education make sense once one understands what has happened in the wider environment in which the university is located. Both are the product of neoliberal public policy. And in his lecture, David Willett suggested that the removal of the number cap on university recruitment means that access to the university need not be seen as a zero-sum game. But he ignored entirely the wider environment of a polarisation of jobs and the fact that in the absence of adaptive upgrading of all jobs, there's necessarily a zero-sum competition for jobs. So essentially what you've got is opening up spaces within the university for access to a labour market subjected to severe competitive pressures. And the stratification of institutions of higher education that government reforms seek to establish means that not all degrees will operate to provide the same labour market advantage. Fear of debt coupled with a perceived lowering of returns to a degree encourages prospective students, especially those from lower income backgrounds, to enrol at lower cost for-profit providers, and that's the intention of the reforms. And the majority of universities become squeezed between for-profit providers and more elite universities. Students from low-income backgrounds end up paying more for degrees which will do little to advance their social mobility. Students at more elite universities are willing to pay significantly higher fees once education becomes a positional good that provides greater chances of getting one of a reduced number of graduate jobs. One already sees this in various surveys, British social attitude surveys, that these attitudes are changing. So, but the internal of the organisation of the university is reconfigured. The new competitive market encourages hierarchical management, a decline of collegial organisation, and the deprofessionalisation of faculty. Shareholder value enters directly in the terms of for-profit providers and indirectly through the outsourcing of services to private for-profit companies offering security, estate or administrative services, usually by reducing terms of employment. So all universities are doing that, and that's part of the agenda of Universities UK for efficiency and modernisation of the university. So low-paid and disadvantaged employment becomes a feature not simply of the wider environment, but also a feature of the university itself, done in the name of enhancing student value at the same time as leveraging those students for revenue. So in this way, the university is not merely part of a wider system of inequality, it's become a microcosm of that inequality. The university as a corporate entity, then, I'm suggesting, is radically different to the corporate university that emerged in the middle of the 20th century, and we shouldn't think there's a simple continuous development. It's significant that when writers like Stefan Collini talk about changes to higher education, they always date them around about the 1980s onwards. That is, they're part and parcel of that development. And for the most part, the analysis has been conducted from the perspective of elite research universities, where the tide of change has been perceived as lapping at the edges rather than threatening to engulf them. But if the analysis that I've given is correct, the protection afforded to the research university, a continued concentration of research funding, high faculty salaries, and a reinforced role in elite social reproduction, is at the cost of the university's role in the citizenship complex. That is, at the cost of its functions for democracy. More broadly, the public university is being replaced by a university at the service of private interests, albeit differentiated from institutions to which functions of vocational training, pacification, and the wider reproduction of inequality is already devolved. So what I want to suggest to you is that public reason, which is part of what the public sphere is supposed to organise in a democratic society, obviously requires more than an effective system of higher education at the service of democratic knowledge. But that is at least one of the conditions of an effectively functioning public sphere. And we can see that as soon as we understand that the marketisation of the university necessarily must replace dialogic reasoning, debate, with market choices and market means of aggregating information. And it's no accident that David Willits should separate out the different functions of the university and regard the association among them as contingent, nor is it an accident that he should neglect or never speak of the democratic functions of a university. And ultimately, I want to propose that it's by understanding the significance of the latter that we can understand not only what the university should be, that is, it should function as an institution for democratic knowledge and public reason, but also what it was, albeit imperfectly, and what it is no longer. Perhaps those of us who are academics can also better understand our own complicity within it. We know too well the costs in terms of the changes to academic conditions of work, but in the words of C. Wright Mills, the US sociologist, we should really connect our private troubles, our concerns about what's happening to our working conditions, to the serious public issues that are also at stake, because the deprofessionalisation of our work is to do with the undermining of the citizenship complex and the function of the university in wider society. Thanks.
Okay, thanks very much, John. We've got a roving mic. If people right at the back have questions, so over to you. We've got a question there, the gentleman in the pink. We'll go one by one at first, and then if pile up.
You just talked about complicity. I wondered whether you would connect some of the disastrous things you talked about with the popularity of the sociologist Anthony Giddens with his third way, which must have been behind a lot of public policy. Someone who actually succeeded Robbins as director of one of the largest and most influential education institutions and so on. It seems to me that a lot of what the Wert Prize, so-called Wert Prize sociology is not very Wert Prize.
No, well, I don't disagree with what you're saying, and in even in terms simply of looking at sociological debates, you could say that what Giddens did was attack the sort of position that I was representing around the citizenship complex. Initially for something which would be more radical, but as political conditions became more difficult, then there was an adaptation to those political conditions, and the radicalism of the position became, yes, part of conformity to market-led solutions and the third way. So I think, and broadly speaking, the third way is in Giddens's work, comes in roughly as inequality is growing, as an accommodation to inequality. And I think without addressing the market, consumerism and so on, but without making any kinds of arguments about social rights and democracy. So, yes, I mean, sociology is complicit. So it's my discipline, but I share that comment.
I would also add that, with reference to Habermas, that the weakness there seems to me, in one analysis, that there is no opposition, there is no true. So everyone, if we all talk together, we're bound to come with some wonderful agreement. And that also, I think, is a false trail. We've got to have some kind of real recognition that there will be violent disagreement. I don't mean to say physical violence, but real disagreement about social things.
Yeah, I would, I think the importance of the public sphere ought to be as a space of plurality and not, yes, and I think that organising your thinking around the public sphere in ideal terms in the way in which Habermas did, yeah, I agree that that's, part of the problem. But I mean, the paradox for me is that the people who are thought of, what's interesting is to reconstruct, if you like, the ideas of writers like Popper or Robbins and what it means for them to hold arguments about openness and plurality when they believe in reducing inequalities, and what it means to be making those arguments in the context of widening inequalities. So to believe that you can simply mobilise Popper for today the way in which Chris Patton has recently done, without saying that actually what we're beset by now is something unanticipated by Popper, and that is widening inequalities and government committed to non-inclusive economic growth. It may sound like a fairly flat thing to say, but I think there's something very significant about the idea of non-inclusive growth at the heart of public policy, because it's the first time that has been really set out explicitly, and I think that's the fracture that Jeremy Corbyn is, that the phenomenon of that shift in the Labour Party represents the recognition that after the observations of Piketty, we're going to be needing to debate inclusive or non-inclusive economic growth, and even no economic growth at all. And the university has to be a space in which that takes place, but the university is now being aligned with economic functions of non-inclusive economic growth.
Okay. Further questions?
You, in a way, you touched on this earlier on with regard to the period, the middle period, as shown in the graph there. That, in fact, at the time, I'm old enough to feel I remember this event. It certainly it didn't feel like, including to radical reformers of various kinds, that there was a citizenship complex and all the rest of it very much at the time. And in fact, there was always pressure for more participation and democratic citizenship going on during that period, which paradoxically has sort of faded now. And then, I don't know whether that's connected with Robin's talking about a common culture, but at the same time we've got to try to fit that with the plurality that you referred to. I'll just be interested in how you see these further, how you see these points in relation to where we are now.
Okay, well, it would partly take me off into a tangent in others. So sociologically, I'm really interested in what is it that happens in the 70s and 80s that marks a political shift that takes Britain from a track of reducing inequality to widening inequality. It's also happening in the US, and the reference to consensus, solidarity, common culture is, I think, part of the problem, because I think what starts to happen in the 1980s is the emergence of a particular kind of racialized politics, and so I would now be looking for a race-based explanation of neoliberalism. I think it's significant that the same process that happens in the US, that the moment that civil rights are won for African Americans, more or less in the 1960s, there's the expectation, and indeed when Parsons writes about race, and it's one of the reasons why I'm interested in his work, he talks explicitly that what is going to happen is the shift from a segregated welfare state into a welfare state that's inclusive of African Americans. I believe that democratic politics, in inverted commas, in the United States were such that rather than extend the welfare state and social rights to African Americans, there was electoral success in removing it from everybody. And that's the birth moment of neoliberalism in the United States, and I think that that is happening in Britain. In putting forward that argument, I'd say, well, it's not, and you see it, it's echoes in debates around ideas of the white working class and so on. Solidarity is meant to transcend issues of whiteness or otherwise. So it's not, I think, that Britain becoming multicultural produces a problem of maintaining solidarity, but there is a failure to argue for solidarity across issues of race and ethnicity. And that's, I think, it's a story for another occasion, but I would say this is a post-colonial story. And if we wish to recover solidarity, we have to recover a form of solidarity which is inclusive of those who get represented as other. And I don't regard those who are represented as other as breaching solidarity of the national welfare state. I regard it as a failure of the national welfare state that it doesn't extend those solidarities otherwise. And I think and it's difficult to see where we're going to have these debates unless we also have them within universities. So for me, the problem is not that I think the university is more important than that debate. I think that having that debate about inequality and how to reduce it, and how to reduce it in a way that's inclusive, and that includes of migrants, refugees, etc. We have to have that debate within universities, but universities are no longer spaces for that kind of debate. Where is that debate taking place? All the discussion of the problems of the public sphere are discussions about how mass media dominate public opinion. But what's the antidote to mass media? It has to be partly the organisation of knowledge within the university. But if the university is becoming marketised, then actually one of the antidotes to mass media is being, undermined. So I'm trying not to put forward a sort of nostalgic account of what the university was about, but to say, well, there was a different trajectory included within it, and that the fact that we've moved on to another trajectory is not just a question of how best should we organise a sustainable university system, but how best should we address issues of democracy and social justice. And the university can't be regarded as separate from those issues of democracy and social justice. It's bound up, in them.
That was more or less the point that I was coming to.
Which is about complicity and how we avoid it, and the fact that the university has become a space where there isn't a structure. One's structurally not able to give voice to this this discourse. My point, therefore, is what do we do about it? Apart from the fact that one sees in further developments, the Green Paper, etc., we're not at the end of it. It feels like we are at the end of it in looking back, but things are going to get worse. So how do we approach this?
Well, organise, resist, make the arguments and join with others who are making the arguments. I mean, one of the reasons why I kind of sort of shifted how I've been sort of thinking about this is that, I was away in the States for a year, and coming back, it was a real shock coming back to a Conservative government. And it has felt to me as if colleagues, at least that I've spoken to, have taken the view, oh, well, that's it. And they're now, that there isn't much chance of changing things, so we've now got to adapt to what is happening. Well, what is happening is I think so profound that we can't adapt to it, and we have to, in a sense. So when I talk about complicity, it's in a sense a complicity that fails to see that what is happening in academic employment is happening in other forms of employment, and that actually starts to argue that it doesn't make sense to speak of a social community or a societal community or a political community unless one is committed to some principles of equality. But we no longer use the language of equality and social justice to think about the university. And it was shocking to me when the Campaign for the Social Sciences produced a report on the value of the social sciences, and they titled it The Business of the Social Science, or The Business of People, where the function of social sciences was to enable elites, whether they were economic or political elites, to understand the public in order to understand the potential obstacles to realising public policy or economic objectives. That's, in a sense, a democratic deficit in how we're thinking about our role as academics. And I think it's... and choosing sort of paths, which for any... I mean, if there are sociologists here who know how odd it is to choose, but in the current debate, what's happening, people are hiding behind the idea of professionalism. That is, oh, well, what we should do is not get involved in politics. We have to be objective. We have to be neutral. And trying to explain and show that the standard account of the professions are not neutral. They are themselves embedded in an idea of citizenship. Take them out of their relationship to citizenship, then they're related to status hierarchy, private property interests. That doesn't make them neutral, so professionalism, objectivity, expertise, reflection does actually have normative embedding, and that embedding is either democracy or, put starkly, is either democracy or the market. And we have no claim we have no claim to speak for or to publics, except that we do that in relation to democracy. Otherwise, doing it in relation to private interests is manipulation and so on.
Okay, I've got Tom at the back. You need a mic?
John, I think you were too modest in responding to the question about complicity, because you yourself are an organiser of a major conference on the 27th of February to try and get academic staff together on a national basis to resist the Green Paper. But what I wanted to put to you was two questions, and I'll put them together. Because that resistance, you made reference to it yourself in the various ways that it can be done. You can go into any detail about it, and I'd be interested in hearing what you had to say in relation, for example, to the vacating by many academics of the terrain of governance, of taking control of institutions back from the managerial class that's grasped it, the defence that academics can make of the quality of their provision, the quality of the research time they get to go away, which is often the individualist orientation that many of us find ourselves subject to, but a defence of the quality of the teaching, of the size of classes, of the access to academic staff. I'd be interested in those questions.
Yeah, well, yes, I absolutely, we need to engage in publicity. I think there's a sort of fatalism amongst academics which says, well, the public don't understand, it's difficult to persuade the public around these issues. Actually, what is overwhelming in opinion surveys is the large percentage of the public doesn't believe in fees for university, is hostile to loans, and is very concerned about widening inequality. So those arguments, or if you like, we don't have to persuade people of the things that if people accept this analysis of what is put here, what I'm putting forward is more or less held by a large part of the British population. So what we have to do is get out there, organise effectively, lobby for it, demonstrate for it, make arguments within our own institutions and among our own colleagues. That's absolutely, that's correct. That's correct. I mean, I don't think. I don't think there will be change unless there is more unruly action, to be straightforward about it. That I've been trying to persuade people, well, how should we respond to the Green Paper? And my view is, and it was there again in Stefan Collini's piece in the London Review of Books, the consultation will generate a lot of comments against it, but the implication Collini said was, and the government will press on with what they're doing. So we need to take action outside the consultation. We need to have alternatives clearly set out, and we need to be lobbying for those alternatives within UCU, within connections to political parties and so on. But I think that there's a lot of statement, you often need a focus to organise around, and I think through the demonstrations against fees, the government learnt to bring its legislation in through statutory instruments and not through debate in the in the House of Commons. It could be a focus for demonstrations and visible public action, but I think that's what is necessary. So the convention is on the 27th in London. People were handing out posters or handouts as we came in, so 27th of February.
Did you have a follow-up question, Tom?
The other question is related to how we persuade colleagues precisely to engage in that kind of resistance. And that takes me back to the analysis that you've given, which was entertaining, if nothing else, seeing Tucker Parsons being presented as a kind of potential radical. But what
It's
I'm
sad that it's
interested in
come
is
to
the way in
this.
which your characterization of these two periods, the period when the universities were a sort of association where the notion of a citizenship complex was in play, in contrast to the growth of neoliberalism later. I suppose my worry is that the way that you were presenting that seemed to suggest that this was a sort of policy choice, independently of the sort of forces that were taking place on the ground. But when you look at those graphs, the graphs that you painted there, and you see the downswing and then the upswing, the paradoxical thing is it not, or maybe it's not so paradoxical, is that the period of Robbins and post-Robbins was exactly the period of the prolonged post-war boom, which came to an end just before that upswing and the introduction of the neoliberal policies. So isn't there a sense in which one response to what you have said that might come from Willis would be that the move to neoliberalism wasn't something simply chosen by us in the interest of greater inequality? It was a necessity forced on us by the fact that the capitalist economy of the world system was going into crisis, not the crisis since 2008 and the financial crash, but a crisis that started to emerge in the 1970s that overlaps with that upswing almost perfectly.
Well, I could show graphs in which the reversal of inequality is much less marked in other places. So I have fairly, I would say, one could argue that it's around particular, features of capitalist political economy. But in referring to something as political economy, one is necessarily locking it into certain arguments around public policy as well. There is no capitalist political economy without a public policy that either secures it or moderates it. And so I'd suggest that I know you're sort of digging at my integral sort of reformism, but I do believe reform is possible. So I do think that there was merit in arguments, not particularly in the Parsons version of the argument, other arguments about how capitalist economy could be socially embedded. And I would suggest that that's kind of where, political arguments and social struggles need to be, because there's not going to be a social struggle against inequality that doesn't begin with some idea of feasible smaller scale reforms. And so that's that's what I think we need to build on, and particularly within the context of the university, there's absolutely nothing necessary about the reforms that are taking place within the university. They're not making the university more financially sustainable. They're, so there's no particular logic other than a policy logic that is dictating what is happening within universities.
Okay, I've got Lars.
Well, the one first actually.
Oh, sorry, go on.
With the rise in tuition fees, like education is now sold as like a private good rather than a public good. Yeah, talking from personal experience, like, you know, only at the age of 20, I don't really, you know of the private good being gained at the moment. So I'm just wondering, like, is there an antidote, you know, for students coming out and feeling they're kind of indebted by, you know, this burgeoning amount of money and like whatever this private good is?
Well, I think the situation with fees is sort of paradoxical at the moment, because in effect it is a 9p in the pound tax on an income above 21,000 or however it's set. So one could say, well, there is an implicit argument for taxation within the idea of fee, and that one could simply shift to a tax-based system, given that the only way in which the way in which the government shifts between presenting it as, well, it's nobody's really paying it, they only pay it if they earn, which is what makes it more like a tax. I think the real risk that is coming is that students will be provided with detailed information about the income associated with the particular degree programme they're on, what students in previous cohorts have earned, and and that information is being gathered, and the intention is to, in a sense, drive students out of degree programmes that are not associated with high-earning jobs. And the reason for doing that is precisely because students that go into jobs that are not high-paying will not themselves pay back, pay back their loans. So I think we're on a process of things will move. If we don't, if we have to sort of block what is happening, push it back. Otherwise, worse is coming down. Down there. It would be very damaging for humanities and some social science subjects. And once again, I mean, I share, the analysis. I mean, Stefan Collini had that in the London Review of Books as well, that what is in the current green paper is not the end point. So we're not at the end point. The end point is people pay back their loans, and one of the ways to get people to pay back their loans is to make sure they don't take them out for courses that don't generate higher income. So it's so for the moment, any student graduating with debt just experiences that debt as a potential burden and, if you like, a cloud on future planning, but it will become, I think, much more real in its consequences as things unfold. And as things unfold, of course, the debt of previous cohorts of students will be changed. Once again, as Andrew McGettigan has pointed out, student loans are the only loan in which the terms under which it's taken out can be changed, not for future groups of students, but for students who took out the loan under a different sort of commitment to what what it involved.
Okay, Lars. Then you.
Thanks for your talk. You and I agree on most parts of your argument, but I do have a worry, and it links up to Tom's worry, the gentleman who asked two questions earlier. All right, microphone coming my way. Right. So my worry is the following. In addressing David Willetts' talk, is this too loud? In addressing David Willetts' talk, you rightfully point out that he doesn't make a connection between higher education and democracy, which you want to do. But what you don't quite pull apart is how David Willetts' argument, especially for the being turned into a corporation of universities, is precisely that is a necessary result of the social inclusion that he says has happened over the past half a century. So his point, very crudely put, seems to be that the social inclusion policies of the post-war period led to a large growth in unis, which made it necessary for them to become run as corporations because they became sometimes billion-dollar institutions. So my worry is that you and David Willetts end up relying on similar language, namely social inclusion, citizenship and Bildung and that kind of language, which may become grist on the mill of someone like David Willetts, who's going to say, well, we agree on that, and David Willetts think, that means that universities have to become more like corporations rather than less. So I'm hoping that you can show me how we can make sure that David Willetts doesn't turn this argument against us as he did in a very cunning fashion.
Well, I suppose, part of what I'd say, I don't mind the university being like a corporation, so long as a corporation is more like a university. Mm-hmm. And that was the trajectory, part of the trajectory that I was setting out that is being reversed. So I do regard that large organisations are necessarily tend to secure better conditions for their workforces. That's kind of demonstrated in terms of earlier sociological arguments and economic arguments about primary and secondary labour markets. So we should wish for our fellow citizens that their forms of employment are in stable, well-run organisations that secure good working conditions. We should wish for our public policy that corporations are regulated with a sense of the public interest in terms of arguments about taxation, social responsibility, and so on. So I don't think that David Willetts does believe in inclusive economic growth. So he may well believe in economic growth, but he believes in it strongly in the context of widening inequality. Widening inequality has taken place because of the undermining of the working conditions of fellow citizens. I don't believe it's necessary that global competition means that the working conditions of fellow citizens have to be undermined, and that there are examples where there's a commitment to social welfare, employment welfare that is consistent with dynamic economic development, broadly Scandinavian countries and so on. What we have are political elites committed to inequality. But, if I put up this diary is about the top income shares and the top 10%, all members of the professoriate are in the top 10%. So part of the problem is that the university reproduces widening inequality in which some of its own members are beneficiaries. And those members who are beneficiaries are the ones that would, within a collegial model, or should, within a collegial model, be committed to the organisation of the university in the interests of democracy rather than the interests of inequality. And I think that's the division, that's a division within the university, and that's part of the process of, of complicity.
Okay, we've just got a few more minutes. I've got a gentleman in a white scarf, and then you at the back.
Yeah, I've got a question about democracy within the university. We start from the observation that in this university there's almost zero democracy within the decision-making processes. Now, I've had various connections with French universities where all senior posts are elected. Heads of school are elected, deans are elected, vice chancellors are elected by the entire university staff. Now, it's not perfect, but that sounds like a much more democratic system than we have in this university. Interestingly, some of the elite universities, like Oxbridge, do have a lot more internal democracy than the newer universities. And I think my question is, how important do you think, is it possible to campaign for internal democracy within universities, and how important do you think an issue that is?
Yeah, I would tend not to, talk about the university's relation to democracy, the idea of the citizenship complex. I'm strongly in favour of the idea of the profession, and the idea of the profession and professional expertise tempers a straightforward argument about participatory democracy. So the organisation of universities is collegial, and that's the model, and collegiality does organise democracy not simply in the terms of, everybody voting, but in relation to representation through different kinds of functions and different characteristics of the members of the university. So I think collegial organisation I'm in favour. In Scotland, of course, there is the von Brzezinski report, which is about governance and reforming the governance of Scottish universities. It does move in a more democratic, in inverted commas, direction, but it's significant. It moves in a direction of, if you like, functional democracy. That is, greater involvement of trade unions, with trade union representatives within governing bodies of the university, greater involvement of elected officials outside the university, and so on, as well as academic staff within it. So I do think there are benefits of Oxford and Cambridge of their collegial form. I wouldn't call them democratic, however, but their collegial form is a protection against arbitrary hierarchical management. So yes, I think governance issues are absolutely important, and one of the chapters of the Green Paper is about governance, is about the corporate form of the university, and is, in a sense, if one goes back and looks at various reports written by the government, one of the possibilities that the government has always wished to make possible is that universities can be taken over by private companies. That is, if a university isn't doing so very well, it can merge with a for-profit entity. But the other thing that that is posited within some of the advisory statements is the possibility of a management buyout of a university. So that is that once one has a thorough-going managerial hierarchy within the university, it is possible, under legislative changes that the government wishes to make, that group could seek private venture capital for a management buyout of the university. And that's in 2010 documents.
Right at the back of the middle, next Katie. Final question. Nice and quick.
So I'll try and keep this brief. It's basically a statement about democracy, universities and all that kind of stuff. So businesses, to my knowledge, are not democratic. There is always an authoritative element to them, so unless you are, of course, the boss. Based on this, I find it to be a contradiction if we are aiming to maintain a sense of democracy in universities. The last thing we should do, or the government should do, is to turn the university into a business, which is subject to the terms and conditions of the market. Yet, how ought we realistically maintain academic freedom or academic democracy in a society that, for the most part, places economic growth firmly in league with public interest? Seems a bit like a fish out of water, if you get what I'm trying to say.
Again, I just stress, I'm not saying universities should become democracies, and I'm not saying that universities shouldn't have effective decision-making processes. So, say a number of things. One is that what I'm stressing is how universities function for democracy is the key thing, not that universities need to be democracies in order to function for democracy. So the second thing is, do universities need to be in, I mean, a lot of the emphasis you get is things like, well, in today's uncertain conditions, etc. There's nothing very uncertain about the operations of a university. The university operates in relation to fairly standard things, that is, the teaching of degrees and the doing of research. One of the things that has happened in Britain is the collapse of research and development within private companies. So if you looked at when Britain had high, it was compared to other OECD countries in the 60s and 70s, Britain had a high proportion of its national income devoted to research and development. What has happened is a collapse of research and development within private corporations as a consequence of neoliberal policies which stress shareholder value. Shareholders don't see the value in long-term investment. So universities are being asked through the impact agenda to take on a role in investment and research and development where the market is failing. And it seems paradoxical to marketize the university in order to get it to produce more commercially oriented research when it's precisely the market that is failing to generate investment in commercially oriented research. So there's not many decisive decisions that university managements have to make. What university managers don't wish to make is decisions that are subject to reflective discussion by their by the people who work within the university. And increasingly academics are asked to identify with the brand of the university and to take actions consistent with the brand in a competitive market context. But none of this is necessary to the organisation. It may be necessary for Coca-Cola to maintain its brand identity, but what is the brand identity of a university other than being a university? What's the brand identity of Brighton compared to Sussex, compared to Nottingham, Birmingham City, or whatever? What they are is universities doing something which is relatively stable and relatively predictable and not at all subject to the vagaries of an uncertain world. This is just a discourse designed to soften up for the translation of public institutions into private processes.
Okay, we have to stop there.
Yep.
We say thanks.